A diplomat who isn't afraid to speak up for victims of human rights abuse around the world. An outspoken critic of the United States, even President Trump, and other powerful members of the United Nations. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights steps down after 4 years in office. What has prompted his departure, and how does he define his legacy? I'm Ghida Fakhry, and I'm speaking with High Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein one-on-one.
I don't believe that these positions should be subject to any political pressure.
For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, we're watching those votes.
I didn't want to be one of these public officials asked in the future, why didn't you speak out?
The United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
I would rather make a mistake speaking out than not saying anything.
High Commissioner Zeid, thanks very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
At the outset, let me offer my condolences. You have lost, we have all lost, a dear friend, a statesman in Kofi Annan. You worked with him quite closely.
Yeah.
How would you describe his legacy, his impact on the UN?
As I have written, the epitome of decency, a very human leader, someone who combined many different qualities into one personality. And I'll give you an example. 10 days before the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, he and I were in The Hague for the inauguration of the International Criminal Court. I was the chair of the governing body, and the Secretary General was there because he was a very strong supporter of the court in the face of determined opposition by the Bush administration. And the time was critical because 10 days later, the Bush administration was going to war. So we sat there, he wanted to have a discussion, and we had a very intense discussion about the court, about the US administration's opposition to it, and about the impending invasion of Iraq. For months, he also had been insisting that he was going to name our second daughter. My wife and I revealed to him that she was expecting, and he insisted that he was going to name the daughter. But he had come up with names which were just impossible for us to pronounce, sort of various African names.
What sort of name?
I can't even remember. And we kept deflecting the names, and I would say, yes, Kofi, we'll think about it. And I never got back to him. And so in the midst of this intense discussion on Iraq and on the ICC and the Bush administration, he looks at me and he says, I haven't forgotten the name. And that was Kofi. That was Kofi, you know, a powerful intellect, insightful, concerned, but very human. And he wouldn't forget these sorts of issues. In the end, we didn't name him after Kofi's, on the basis of Kofi's advice. We didn't name her, sorry, on the basis of Kofi's advice. But he was persistent.
He was persistent, and you were perhaps less diplomatic there than you have been over the last 4 years. But since you did mention Kofi Annan and the establishment of the International Criminal Court, you played an instrumental role in setting it up. One major criticism, though, over the years about the court is that it has often gone after small fish, not the big sharks. It has disproportionately targeted, for example, African states. Kofi Annan did, belatedly at some point, when he was pushed, say that the invasion in 2003 of Iraq was illegal. Did you agree with him then? Do you agree with him now?
I think there was a belief at the time that the Security Council needed a second resolution to legitimize the military actions undertaken. And when he finally did say that he believed it was illegal, I think it echoed and reflected much of the sentiment that existed in the international community. The court itself was always going to depend on the cooperation of states to succeed. And the jurisdictional regime is a complex one. So yes, it seems like it's set its sights on African states, but there are many preliminary investigations that are taking place or examinations outside of Africa as well.
I mean, the crime of aggression is included in
Yes.
the ICC statute, and
Yes.
yet President Bush, Prime Minister Blair are
Yes.
doing quite well, not worried in the least, I imagine, of ever facing a judge. Same thing regarding the invasion of Libya, Yemen, the ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, which you yourself have called a textbook case of ethnic cleansing and genocide. You must be disillusioned by the ICC, are you?
No, because you're looking at changing the behavior of humankind, which was set in place over 8,000 years. And if it takes us a few decades to convert the human being from a rather primitive being to something more enlightened, where you create limits to what it is that we do in war, we have to accept that. Look.
But in a perfect world, though, do you think that the leaders of the UK and the US should have faced international justice for invading Iraq? I mean, yes or no?
The evidence will always point to an individual. I'm often, when I go to countries, people will say to me, do you think the Prime Minister should be investigated for this? Or do you think the President should be hauled off to The Hague? It happened to me on a number of visits. My response is the evidence will lead. And if the evidence is there, yes, there should be no one excluded from a criminal prosecution if they've seen to be committed, if they're seen or understood to have committed crimes against humanity, war crimes. And I don't give up, no. I mean, in certain respects, when you look back at the US invasion of Iraq, the crime of aggression had not been activated. And so you can't go back and have a look at those crimes in that context.
But now that it has been.
In the future, yes. And it'll come. We have to be patient.
The conviction record is dismal of the court, and I do want to move on. I just wonder if it isn't always going to be the usual suspect that the court goes after. If, seriously, you could imagine the day when it does go after the leaders of powerful countries like the US, like the UK, for crimes that have been committed, for crimes of aggression.
I don't exclude any of that. Again, we're in the process of building the court. It hasn't achieved universal adherence. We need to still have, I think, 60, 70 countries to join. And it's work in progress. I don't discount that in the future that would happen.
Well, since Kofi Annan was Secretary General, we mentioned him earlier, the world has changed quite a lot. So has the United Nations. Yeah. You are now stepping down after 4 years as High Commissioner, 4 very vocal years, one might say. You are, I believe, as well, the first UN official, at least senior UN official, to have criticized directly and sharply the sitting President of the United States. Yeah. Is that the reason why you are stepping down now?
It could be. You need to ask the US.
But did that motivate your decision not to seek another term, knowing that your boss, Antonio Guterres, might not have wanted you to stay on?
Look, I understood from my first election that the Permanent Five, the practices that the Permanent Five of the Security Council have to agree to the nomination by the Secretary General. And at least informally, there's this practice. And halfway through my mandate, I had enough meetings with the Permanent Five to realize that it would be practically impossible unless, from their perspective, I backed down on a number of issues, and I wasn't prepared to back down.
What was the primary issue, do you think, that they would have wanted you to back down?
No, they all had their various issues. Every time we raised anything regarding any of them, whether it be on migration policy, emergency laws, overreach of the executive, treatment of the LGBTI community, Tibet, Xinjiang, there was always going to be a reaction from the Permanent Five, and there always was. And so I understood, at least from some of them, that if I was to signal my intention to continue, it would probably require me to change my behavior, and I wasn't going to do that.
And that's something you didn't want to do. But let's face it, though, you did take on the President of the United States. I mean,
I started when he was still candidate when I started.
He was candidate when you first said that
and I just continued.
He was candidate, I remember, just with a few weeks to go before his election, when you did say that you believed he would be dangerous from an international point of view.
Yes.
Did you simply think he wouldn't make it as president, or were you simply not that keen to keep your job?
No, I was interviewed by another media network, and I said to them, and I still believe this to be the case, I didn't want to be one of these public officials who, when asked in the future by his children or by anyone else, you were in a public position, if you had all these misgivings, why didn't you speak out? And I wasn't going to be one of those. And I felt that whether he won or lost, what he was saying seemed to me to be dangerous, and I felt I had to say it.
And of course, there's no way the Secretary General would have kept you on board, though, having been so vocal about the most powerful member of the UN, though.
You have to ask the Secretary General.
I know that, you know that. Just a very quick yes or no answer, if I may. Did he ask you to step down after just one term?
No. I wrote to him, and I said I wanted to inform him that I wouldn't be pursuing a second term, and I wanted to give him enough time to find a successor. I then had an interview with a journalist who sort of brought it out of me. I was planning to say something soon, but it came out in the context of the interview, and then I wrote a letter to the staff, and then it was known that I wasn't seeking a second term.
You said that to be reappointed to my job would be to fail.
Yes.
Should there then just be one term for high commissioners? In fact, even just one term for UN secretaries general? Would that be more conducive to real change as opposed to the cosmetic changes we always talk about?
Yes, I don't believe that these positions should be subject to any political pressure or be seen to be, or at least the insinuation is that you could be subject to political pressure, and that shouldn't be the case. One term would be sufficient for both posts. It could be extended instead of 4 years, maybe 5, 6 years. One term would be enough. Yeah, you might need a sort of a clause where if the person is utterly derelict and not, fulfilling their duties, that there is an easier way to ask them to leave if they're falling short.
Well, when you became High Commissioner back in 2004, no one really expected you, a prince, an ambassador from a conservative monarchy, to take on the world's elites, including Western leaders.
Yes.
You did, though.
Yes.
After all, your government, I should also mention Jordan, was never particularly keen on human rights. Same goes for many of the governments in the region. Were you misjudged, or did you become a rebel somewhere along the way? A rebel with a cause?
No. Look, Ghida, my first experience after leaving Jordan was serving with the UN in the former Yugoslavia. 2 years of serving with the heads of mission, getting to know and being familiar with what happened in those states that broke away from the former Yugoslav republics. So we had Croatia and Bosnia. What I saw with my own eyes made me think that if ever I was in a position of responsibility like that, I would not be silent. There were times in that UN peacekeeping operation when I felt that we were not disclosing the full truth about what was happening to the Security Council and to the international community for fear of triggering a series of actions. I remember once Tuzla was bombed, and we were worried about it being activated as a safe area, and the report that we sent basically covered the event, but not entirely the way that we were seeing it. And my feeling was that if in a position of responsibility serving the UN, I would rather make a mistake speaking out than not saying anything, and then being asked in the future, why didn't you say anything? You knew this was happening. Why did you stay quiet? And I didn't want to be in that position.
You didn't want to be in that position then. I suppose you don't want to be in a position now where you have to toe the line, mince your words. I have to go back to the inescapable, and that is President Trump and his constant assault on the post-World War II norms of international diplomacy, international relations. We know he's pulled out of so many international agreements. He pulled the US out of the Human Rights Council. Is that, in your view, consequential at all? Does it matter to have the US in or not? And what worries you most about him?
If it produces a run, in other words, if when the US pulls out from a certain body, agency, council, others begin to follow suit, then clearly this is dangerous, because as we saw with the League, this very building in which we're sitting in, when the exits, when a number of countries began to exit the League, it then produced a run. Eventually, I think 8 countries withdrew, and the whole thing, by the time the Second World War ended, it had collapsed. And so that is the concern, that if the US leaves these bodies and others follow suit, then yes, the architecture that we've created post-Second World War to protect and promote sort of human rights, and then the security architecture, everything is in danger there. And so we want to be, sorry.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but I believe when the council was established, the US was not even elected to it. So does it make a difference?
That's true. One will have to see. I mean, it's true the US was not in, the US entered. The very action of coming out, though, could inspire others to follow suit.
But do you think there's a little bit too much alarm around President Trump, though? I mean, is it fair to blame all of the sins of the US on him? Because, I mean, I recall, as you probably do, that under President Obama, there was an extraordinary amount of daily drone attacks taking place in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and there was very little said right here in this building or at the UN headquarters in New York. Virtual silence. Did you take Obama on the way you might take Trump on?
No, I mean, you raise a very good point. You know, when the Feinstein report came out, that alleged in a very strong language that torture had taken place during the Bush administration, it was therefore incumbent upon the Obama administration to follow this up with then investigations and prosecutions of it. It's required as a matter of law. And we raised this point with the US officials, and I raised it publicly, and I raised publicly also the concerns over a number of issues in the US when it came to Guantanamo, Ferguson, excessive use of force by the police, disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. All these issues were raised publicly. In the case of the Obama administration, there was a robust discussion over these issues. There was no attempt to deflect, but we engaged.
But there was hardly an outcry. There was hardly an outcry, given the fact that Obama did authorize, didn't he, more drone attacks than George W. Bush did in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the silence across the international community. I don't think we, my office or the experts, were silent over this. And there was an interaction, there was an exchange. You know, we went public, there was an exchange, we discussed these issues. That has largely been missing with the Trump administration.
But do you think when there is such complete impunity and immunity for those who commit these types of crimes, in times of peace, I mean, would you agree, for example, that these would amount to extrajudicial killings in peaceful times, that the perpetrators should be brought to justice? Do you feel that by not saying very much, not you, not just you, but the UN as a whole, is an accomplice?
We have to look at each specific case. I mean, clearly, there's enough literature out there that will make the claim that these are extrajudicial killings and they have to be properly investigated, and then if there is guilt to be assigned, that has to lead to punishment. But we'd have to look at each particular case. I mean, I do believe that the UN, given the experiences that I've had in the past, should not be a silent witness to atrocities or killings that are unlawful. And then while we in the human rights community tend to be outspoken, all of us, the experts, our office, we on occasion would like to see the rest of the UN say more.
But you tend to be outspoken on crimes that the West in general tends to be outspoken about as well. I say you, not just you.
About all of them.
You have been, but you as the UN system. And I just wonder, for example, in the case of Yemen, since you say let's look at specific examples. In the case of Yemen, there's been virtually deafening silence. If President Bashar al-Assad should be held accountable, as you have suggested before, for the crimes his Air Force is allegedly committing, should the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and anyone else enabling them with weapons and assistance also be held to account for what their bombers are doing to children and civilians in Yemen?
As I've said before, wherever the evidence leads, the law should follow, irrespective of rank or
Isn't there sufficient evidence that children, civilians, are being killed every day, and there's virtually anything being said about that?
And well, look, for the rest of the international community, I can't speak on behalf of capitals that are not saying anything. What I can only speak on behalf of our office, and our office has been determined, and we've spoken out because we have People working in Yemen, I've spoken to them, I've seen the evidence myself. You mentioned Syria. I mean, what has happened in that country is so outrageous, but like so many conflicts, the extreme comes very quickly. Children are targeted, hospital facilities, medical facilities, people are besieged, people are starved, disease reigns. In the end, I cannot imagine a Syria which in part sort of returns to a semi-normal existence if you don't have criminal accountability, if people are not brought before the courts for the excessive violence that they visited on the civilians in Syria. I mean, it's almost...
But High Commissioner, when you say people, who do you mean? Because, for example, the late Kofi Annan resigned as Special Envoy for Syria, blaming the inaction squarely on the Security Council,
yeah.
but it clearly goes beyond the Security Council, doesn't it? This has turned into a proxy war. It isn't good versus evil.
No,
I mean, a lot of external forces are fueling the fire, arming the opposition, giving rise to ISIS. Who would you bring to account?
Well, only a few kilometers away from where we sit, there is an entity, this independent international investigation for Syria, that's collecting this evidence that comes from these inquiries. We have the Syria Commission of Inquiry. That evidence goes to this body, and they look at it very deeply, and they look at the lists, and they look at the names, and they're taking evidence which is broad and linking it to individuals. And then they look to see who is linked to who, and when the right conditions obtain in terms of a country or an entity that's ready to prosecute, then the information will be ready. So I am hopeful that what we've seen, the worst of the sort of atrocities in Syria, will be prosecuted before a court of law. Those involved will be prosecuted, and it could end up being very high individuals. So I wouldn't exclude that.
And the Syrian conflict, in fairness, has been covered. The bloodletting and destruction is well documented. But I have to mention that in your farewell speech to the Human Rights Council, you listed a number of human rights egregious situations.
A lot of them.
A lot of them, including some that very few UN leaders ever mention. Jammu and Kashmir, one of them, Western Sahara, under Moroccan occupation since 1975. Around you there is silence, though. A lot of hypocrisy, many would say. Should the UN, do you believe, and you are stepping down in just a few days, so I believe you can pretty much say what you like, not that you haven't so far, but do you think that it should uphold international law, call for an end to foreign occupation wherever it occurs?
There is a phenomena in New York which is strange. And that is, there is seemingly, if you look at the agenda of the Security Council, an overwhelming preoccupation with Africa and the MENA region. Not that Africa and the MENA region should be sort of outside scrutiny.
But that is precisely what the West wants the preoccupation to be about.
Yes, and there are many other situations which deserve to be looked at. I mean, by the UN Security Council, they deserve the attention. It's hard for us to believe when we see a declining human rights condition in the Kashmir Valley, for instance, for a variety of reasons outlined in our report, that the Security Council doesn't have that on its agenda. We have two nuclear powers, sizable countries, important countries, and that have been sort of in the standoff for so long, and yet the inability of the Security Council to have a look at that, I think, is actually something that needs to be addressed and changed.
But that precisely brings me to another problem, I assume, and challenge that you've faced, is this growing politicization of human rights. Do you think that human rights should fall under the ambit of the Security Council? Because after all, we saw what it has led to in terms of a logjam on Syria, on the Rohingya, and there are other issues to do with North Korea where China as well has objections. Do you feel that human rights are getting increasingly politicized, the situation is getting worse, or should the Security Council in fact deal with human rights?
Look, it's a very good question. There's no doubt that when you look at the discussions between the governments themselves, there's a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of cowardice, a lot of double standards being used, because you have a country that's willing to attack another, but its own record can be called into question, right? So none of them are pristine when it comes to their records, and so you have this allegation which is being used, a great deal of double standards. I think from our point of view, from the point of view of the Human Rights Office in the UN, we approach all countries equally. What I'd like to see is that when we make a recommendation to the Human Rights Council, or at least if we have the approach open to us to the Security Council, and we say, we believe you need to look at this, that they should be paying attention to us. Yes, that I think they should do. But in the discussions between them, I mean, that phenomena is there.
Because there is a nexus, isn't there, between human rights violations and conflict.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How would you describe your own legacy in the last few moments that we have as High Commissioner for Human Rights?
Yeah.
What do you think was your biggest achievement, and where have you failed?
Well, I was having breakfast not long ago, and my 15-year-old daughter walked into the kitchen, and she had her headphones and a backpack like any teenager would, and she looked at me and she said, so how long are you going to remain a grey UN bureaucrat? I'd like to think if anyone is evaluating my record, they are thinking in a manner more admiring than my 15-year-old. But really it's left to others to assess the work that I and my office have done over the last 4 years. I like to think that we have tried our best. My conscience is clear, and I'm sure my successor will follow suit.
High Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, thank you very much indeed, and all our best wishes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.